Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's ERM webinar on testing COVID-19, decisions using U.S. intelligence methods. My name is Vanessa Carrillo, and I'm the Associate Director of Administration for the ERM program. So before we begin, I'd like to share a couple of ERM upcoming events with you. The next event we have scheduled is for April 21st. It's titled COVID-19 and Enterprise Risk Management, How Pandemic Scenarios Have Made Some Organizations More Prepared. So our own Academic Director, Sim Siegel, and Deputy Academic Director, Basil Rabinowitz, will be leading this discussion. The next event is scheduled for April 28th. This will be a presentation with senior ERM risk practitioners from the United Nations. The discussion will be focused around ERM practices at the UN. One last note to everyone is if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A tool, which is located at the bottom of your screen, to type in questions. Now I would like to introduce ERM's Academic Director and Senior Lecturer in Discipline, Sim Siegel.
Thank you, Vanessa. Welcome, everyone. There will be Q&A at the end of the session, as Vanessa said. This event will be recorded and the recording will be made available up on our website, but the Q&A will not be recorded. That portion will not be recorded. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's session, Steve Lindo. Steve Lindo is a professional risk manager with over 30 years of experience managing risks in financial and other organizations. Besides designing and teaching courses for Columbia's Masters in Enterprise Risk Management, he is principal of SRL Advisory Services, an independent consulting firm specializing in risk management methods and strategy. And he's co-principal of Intelligent Risk Management LLC, an executive education and advisory partnership which shows organizations how to test their high-stakes decisions using analytical methods pioneered by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. Excuse me. Steve previously held risk management positions at Fifth Third Bancorp, Ally Financial, Cargill Financial Services, First Chicago, now part of JP Morgan Chase, and Lloyds Bank. Steve is a regular presenter at conferences and author of risk management articles and case studies. He has a BA and MA from Oxford University and speaks fluent French, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. Steve, welcome and thanks for taking the time to share these insights with us.
Thanks so much, Sim, and hello, everybody. If it was a different situation, I would be standing behind a lectern and I would be shading my eyes and looking out at a bunch of faces in the crowd. Well, sadly, I can't do that today, but it's still an unexpected pleasure to be sharing some information with you today. I wish that the circumstances were a little happier, but nonetheless, as many of us have risk management in our DNA, so part of our job is to deal with the situation that we're currently going through, and hopefully some of what you hear today will help you do that. So let me tell you what I have in mind. Just briefly, I want to put the context around the US intelligence methods that I'm going to describe today in terms not only of what types of decisions need to be made during times of crisis like the current COVID-19 one, and how traditionally risk management has participated in those decisions, or perhaps in certain circumstances has not. So with that as a background, then I'm going to get right into the brief description of the kinds of methods that have been pioneered by the US intelligence agencies, and in particular, using a key assumptions check to walk through an actual decision so that you can actually see this method in practice. And I know it's going to be a bit of a sprint through all of this material. So when I finish up, hopefully there'll be time for questions, as Sim mentioned earlier. And if for any reason questions can't be answered because time runs out on us, hopefully my communication, my contact information is there. Anyone who has a question that doesn't get answered, I will be happy to do so after the session is over. So let's get right into it. So shock and horror, we're in a crisis, and it's not the first, and no doubt it won't be the last. But in terms of how companies, and in fact even individuals, deal with these kinds of crisis situations, they have to take decisions that for them typically are unprecedented. So it could be a political situation like Brexit, it could be a financial meltdown like the one triggered by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. And of course now here we are in the midst of a moving target and a health crisis of unprecedented proportions. So these crisis decisions, they're not the kind of day-to-day decisions that we typically are used to. And so it creates a challenge for us and for those of us involved in risk management, how to deal with these kinds of situations. So crisis decisions, they really are the ultimate challenge because time is of the essence. Typically, there are many different moving parts, a tremendous amount of uncertainty, data flowing in from all sides, most of it not completely vetted as risk managers would typically want to be able to do. In the midst of it, a number of different capabilities and organizational functions, all trying to make sense of it, but no doubt dealing with their own fears, emotions, concerns, and so on. And then if that's not enough, then you layer on top of that politics at the national or regional level and the influence of various stakeholders within each organization. And then finally, the whole apparatus of this decision-making, the stakes are tremendously high because people's lives and their property and their money, they are all hanging in the balance on each and every one of these highly complex decisions. So in the face of these unexpected and challenging circumstances, it's quite natural, even in the most sophisticated organizations, that their decision-making is nowhere near as clear and as effective as it would normally be. The overload of information can simply overwhelm all of the participants trying to make sense of what is or isn't fact and so on. The data may in fact, whatever data you have may even be conflicting or incomplete or inconclusive. The biases that we all have to deal with, and in normal circumstances, we have typically enough self-awareness to know when we are potentially at prey for biases. If we decide to make a decision, perhaps we'll sleep on it and think about it the next morning just to make sure that we didn't make a rash decision. But in these circumstances, all of these biases are flowing around, you know, a little bit like a highly charged atmosphere in which the decision-making takes place. There's a tendency to go for shortcuts. People are just want to get the decision made. There's a sense of uncertainty that makes decision-making abandon the more traditional prudent ways. It's not just organizational influence that also is a factor. Organizational silence. There can be people in the room who have highly valuable information, but because the situation, the conversation is very volatile, or there's a tremendous amount of emotion in the air, they may not speak up, and in doing so, refrain from providing information which might be crucial to making a good decision. So why is it that organizations have trouble trying to deal with all of these crisis decision-making challenges? So part of it is because the day-to-day practice of decision-making, and it doesn't matter if you're in a small, medium, or large, or global organization, typically the decision-making acquires a certain rhythm and process. Each company or organization's culture, the hierarchy, the personalities, they all come to define how a company makes decisions, and the practice day in, day out makes that a very stable and typically a reliable process. Those decisions can be made quickly. People get used to interpreting their communications from their peers. They have data that's prepared and packaged in a very user-friendly way. Those of us that work in risk management, we know how important it is not just to have the data, but also to package it in a way that it can be available when decisions are being made. And there isn't anything like a facilitator or a chairman or an umpire or anybody who actually oversees the decision-making process. It becomes essentially not exactly an automatic, but a very well-oiled process. So nobody's really in charge. Now, as we flip the situation into kind of the dark unknown where some of us are struggling in the current crisis, instead of using these well-practiced methods that companies typically use for their decision making, all of a sudden, the most important thing, or these three things that I'm highlighting here, don't seem at all natural. In an urgent situation, there's a tendency to want to make a fast decision, but in fact, the better strategy is to think very disciplined and to think slowly, look at things from different angles, be very respectful of the uncertainty and complexity that may well be apparent and prevalent in all the information that's available, and make sure that nobody in the room who has valuable information is allowed to be silent. Make sure that all the key stakeholders for any decision are there and that they're expected and know that they're expected to contribute. So essentially, these are unusual types of decision making. Companies don't practice them very often. And so as a result, because of the lack of practice, typically companies are ill prepared for the types of decisions that they're now having to make in the COVID-19 crisis. So I just want to find out who you all are. Of course, I can't see you all, but just as a way to be able to tell me what you as a collective audience, how you are in terms of your contributions to crisis decision making. Liz, if you could be kind enough just to run this poll, we'll just take a minute to see what our participants think about this particular question. This really just gives me a little bit of an eyeball on our audience, and hopefully you'll find out as well how you as a group, how well you're represented in crisis decisions that have been made in the past or are currently being made. So it's very interesting that we're almost evenly split. There are some of you who clearly, because of your status or the organizations where you work, you feel very engaged in crisis decision making. Some of you certainly have seen it, but you haven't actually been included in an active manner. And an equivalent proportion of you all have not had that experience. Well, I'm not saying hopefully, but likely is during the coming weeks and so, all of you will be involved in these kinds of decisions. So it's good to know that our audience is diversified, and hopefully some of what you hear today will help you with these types of decisions going forward. Thanks, Liz. If you could go ahead and close that poll. So just briefly to get us to like our launch point for looking at the US intelligence methods, essentially, from my perspective, risk management has a very clear role when it comes to the day-to-day types of decisions. The ones that we saw before that are practiced on a regular and continuous basis have a rhythm. Each company has its own style, its own method. There's no right or wrong, but risk management is well represented. They provide the infrastructure, the platform that helps good decisions to be made, and they provide metrics as well as expert knowledge and so on. So risk management plays this very predictable and valuable role. It's not nearly so clear what kind of role risk management plays in crisis decisions, because these same methods that have been developed in order to be able to facilitate efficient and prudent decision-making on day-to-day methods, they weren't designed to be used in crisis situations. There's a sense of spontaneity and lack of preparedness, as I mentioned before, all of those emotions and biases all circulating during the decision-making process. None of those are core competencies of the methods that risk management has typically been trained and actively practices. And some of you, no doubt, are very expert at that. So this is where we transition into the principles and the practices that the US intelligence services have used. And so for us, this is a domain transfer. We are going to step temporarily away from the familiar turf of risk management in large organizations in many different industry sectors. All of a sudden, we're going to look at the methods that have been practiced by people that we know about, but we don't feel that sense of, we can't identify with them because they work in a totally different universe. But their methods, hopefully, as we'll see, their methods can be very valuable in these extraordinary times. So why is it that the US intelligence services have something of a track record and a very disciplined practice when it comes to crisis decisions? Well, the first reason for that is that these kinds of crises and these strange, unusual, and highly complex and emotionally charged decisions, this is what they do every day. They have to deal with all kinds of physical and non-physical strife, terrorism, political influence, drug trades, all the kinds of potentially damaging man-made as well as natural phenomena. These are things that are in their inbox every single day. So not surprisingly, they have developed their own framework that is designed specifically to be able to deal with those challenging issues that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The generic title for these techniques is Structured Analytic Techniques, and the compendium of them really comes from a combination of research done by well-known psychologists, people like Daniel Kahneman, if you know about his writings, as well as the daily trial and error and practice and learning from dealing with all of these kinds of crisis situations day in, day out. And the emphasis that's placed on these techniques is even further reinforced after 9/11. The US Congress came together to be able to create mandated standards for intelligence practices, which were all concerted into the 2004 Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. So these methods that I'm talking about, and there are more than 50 of them, they are in daily practice. And we're going to look at just a couple of them. Basically, we're going to look at two of these structured analytic techniques, which are intentionally designed to be able to test decisions. Some other of these techniques are more in order to think innovatively or to think to challenge the existing postures and mindsets, but these two key assumptions, two structured analytic techniques, they're designed to test decisions. The pre-mortem, this is something you may even have heard about or practiced. It's not so far removed from a stress test where you take a future situation and you look for ways that potentially, what are the methods that could happen to create that? So you basically, without the taint of emotion that comes from looking at a failure and trying to figure out what was the root cause of that failure, you look at a hypothetical failure, not an imaginary one, but one which could but hasn't happened, and you analyze its causes and hopefully come up with some remedies which can make it less likely. The one that we're going to look at for the purposes of today's session is the key assumptions check. So underlying these critical decisions, the crisis decisions, there are a raft of assumptions which are in the mind of all the individuals who contribute to the decision. The question is, they typically don't speak those assumptions out loud, and they don't have a disciplined process for asking themselves, well, is my assumption based on fact, or is it based on opinion, or is it based on fear or any other kind of concerns, possibly optimism or pessimism, whatever the factors that may be that create those assumptions. The key assumptions check is designed to give them essentially an evidentiary test to check whether or not the underlying data that supports those assumptions is or isn't reliable. So the way that the decision is made essentially is not relevant to the key assumptions check. It can be done in a very collaborative manner. It can be done in a very hierarchical manner. Doesn't matter. The way that companies and organizations make decisions is unique to each one. The key assumptions check, however, is equally applicable to any decision-making method. It just simply takes the main components of that decision essentially and digs into them and identifies and then documents how well or to what extent the confidence in those assumptions is justified. The other important thing, and going back to what I said before, is for these types of crisis decisions, it's critical that there's a collaboration between the different stakeholders in the results of these decisions. So different functions within the organization, could be risk, could be finance, tax, legal, human resources, business lines, and so on, should all be participating. It's not a one-man show. It's not a risk management expertise. Risk management, if they are able to implement this kind of process, becomes essentially the umpire to make sure that this key assumptions check takes place in a rational and objective manner, and that it's documented so that anyone who's then looks at the results of this analysis can see exactly what it is that the check identified. So you think that it's a one-shot deal? It's not. There are 5 distinct steps to the key assumptions check process. And they may not be intuitive in the sense that sometimes these may seem as if they're a little bit academic, but that's not at all the case. the most important thing is that you don't progress from one step to the next until everyone is agreed on exactly what it is that the key assumptions check is going to verify. So the first step of this process is actually to ask yourself, what is the decision that we're making? What is the key question that needs to be answered by the analysis that the key assumptions check will perform? And we'll look into that and the individual components of this process in just a minute. Then those assumptions that I mentioned before, they're going to be tabulated. We're going to look at working assumptions. These are all the assumptions that have to hold in order for the desired outcome to occur. And not all of them are equally weighted. So for the purposes of the analysis, what we'll do is we'll pick the ones which are most critical to the desired outcome. They'll be the key assumptions. And what we'll do is we'll provide a rating method. You'll see exactly how the rating structure is. And I'll show you a couple of examples so that you can see in contrast the way that the ratings work with two different sets of assumptions. Then, to finalize this 5-step process, the parties, the group that performs the key assumptions check then has to arrive at some inferences, basically some recommendations, some conclusions. What do the ratings say that we have diligently and as objectively as possible examined and rated, and then to communicate the results to the executive managers who are the ones tasked and responsible for these high-stakes decisions. So we're going to go through all 5 steps, but we're going to focus in particular on the first 3 because that's going to be the technique that I've chosen to show to you today. And the example that I'm going to give you is something that has already been made. Most organizations have made decisions of varying kinds about their remote working by their employees. Now, 2 months ago, this might have been more of a speculative example, but the time has passed so quickly. So in fact, when I prepared the sample that I'm going to show you today, it was actually on March 13th. And that seems like only days ago, but a month ago, companies were still trying to decide whether or not it was in their best interest to transition to remote working. So we'll see this example. It's now historical in the sense that it's now a decision that's already been made, but it will show you the way that this particular test, the key assumptions check, was performed on an example that is relevant to the current COVID crisis. So step number 1, as I mentioned before, this is to make sure that you and all the participants in this exercise are in agreement as to what is the key question. So I'm going to make you the invisible participants in this first part of the exercise, and I'm going to ask Liz to run the poll again. And now I appreciate that you haven't had any training or preparation, but I'm going to ask you to use your polling and to the best of your ability decide which of these 4 should be the key question that the key assumptions check should be addressing, that we're going to be going through on the subject of remote working. And anytime you're able to share the polling as it goes, Liz, that would be great. In the meantime, just so that to kind of create a little bit more comprehension around the key question, this is something which can completely derail the entire exercise of the key assumptions check. Because if the question is too narrow, or if the question only addresses part of the situation that is truly the one that needs to be decided, then as a result, the key assumptions check can check the assumptions for the wrong, basically for the wrong decision. So this first exercise is essentially, if this one is wrong, then the whole key assumptions check can produce either a false sense of security or potentially can raise concerns that don't need to be there. So it's absolutely critical to get this right. So what did our poll show us here? Okay, thank you, Liz. So I see that we had a pretty high percentage, 64%, that actually went for the 4th of the key of the questions. So thanks, Liz. You can close out the poll. So first of all, let me say hearty congratulations. Those of you that picked number 4, you completely and accurately identified the question, which is the one that we're going to be examining. And there are 2 things that I want to say about that. First of all, as I mentioned before, the first 3 questions have been deliberately framed rather narrowly. And they're not bad questions. They're not wrong questions. It's just that the key question for whether or not the decision should be yes or no to having employees work remotely isn't about these technical issues. It is about what is the purpose of our organization, and can we fulfill that purpose in a reliable manner if we make this decision. And more than anything, this last of the 4 questions is an open-ended question. It's not, is it can we or not? It's not a yes-no question. It's to what extent, because that's how we are going to look at the relativity of the assumptions and how they're rated when we actually get into the key assumptions check. All right, so moving on now. This chart's a little bit small. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it any bigger, but what I did here was that on your behalf, I drafted 10 working assumptions. Now, these assumptions aren't all necessarily the key ones, but they're all relevant. So we're looking at the infrastructure questions, the systems, whether or not the employees actually have the equipment they need, whether they're trained and they know enough to be able to even to log into the systems remotely, whether or not we can keep the systems running, based with a skeleton staff on our premises, even, beyond our reach, whether or not the internet can carry the huge amount of traffic of all the organizations needing to have their employees work remotely. What about data confidentiality? Will it be affected or undermined by having so many employees logging in remotely? What will our competitors be doing if maybe we decide to go remote, but our competitors don't, and our business suffers as a result? That's an important consideration. Will our employees stay healthy? This is a health crisis. It's not just a question of where you are, but whether or not you can stay healthy. Is the job description of our employees, can it even be performed remotely? Some can, some can't. And then lastly, if we go towards the remote employment, how will this affect our relationship with our customers, suppliers, and partners? Will they be tolerant of any inconveniences and so on? So these are all perfectly valid working assumptions, but we can't use so many in order to be able to check them all, because we have to focus on the most relevant ones. And this is a practice which has been refined over time. The intelligence services came up with not a magic number. Typically it's 5. So 5 of these assumptions, I have selected them for you, that are the most key ones. So here we are. You can see which ones they are. So I picked 2. I picked infrastructure, I picked employee capabilities, and I also picked whether or not what will be the impact on our customers. So I'm not ignoring the remaining 5 of the working assumptions, but I'm showing here that in order to be able to do the rating and the check, and to essentially to dig right into whether or not these assumptions are supported by evidence, we're going to work with a manageable number, which is 5. So now we're going to put those key assumptions into the key assumptions check table. So you can see I've got them listed on the left, but I haven't, at this point, put in any of the ratings, because I want to give just a few minutes to explain how the rating system works here. Now, of course, you've probably worked with rating systems of one kind or another. So you realize that we're talking about a convention here, and that's not something that you can necessarily intuit. But by giving you a scale of 1 to 10, and also, so therefore what we can do is that we can, as a result of an honest and objective rating process, what we can do is that we can determine, relatively speaking, whether or not the ratings are high enough or low enough in order to establish a sense of confidence that we can then convert into the inferences or the conclusions, and then deliver those conclusions in steps 4 and 5 to the audience that needs to hear them. So let me give a little bit of a narrative around the headers across the top of the key assumptions check. So first of all, these assumptions are the ones which have to persist in order that the desired outcome, to have a high level of confidence in the desired outcome. So if our employee is working remotely, the desired outcome will be able to serve our customers safely and reliably. We need to have a high level of confidence that they can perform their duties remotely, that they have the equipment necessary to log in and interact with our systems, that we can train the employees that don't have the prior skills working remotely on how to do that. Obviously, that's something which Columbia demonstrated amply with the huge transition of remote teaching to members of the faculty. We need to be sure that our systems will support the increased communications traffic. And then lastly, we need to have a high level of confidence that our customers won't abandon us if we make this decision, but rather that they will accept the limitations because they know and understand the ambient circumstances that make this crisis decision necessary. So those are our key assumptions. Now, if you look at the columns, the first two columns on the left, these are the data columns. These columns are the way in which the level of confidence in the data that supports these assumptions is going to be rated. The next two columns to the right, these aren't the data columns, these are the impact columns. And so in other words, if the data is or doesn't inspire confidence, is that going to impact the overall outcome? And if it is, to what extent? Is it going to be high impact, low, or medium impact? So looking at the first two columns here, what we can see is that how relevant and certain is the evidence? Now, this essentially has to do with the actual data that you have, whether it's internet traffic, whether it's digital data, whether it's information in the HR department's files about the employee training, whether it's the level of technical build and sophistication of the systems. It's what we do or don't know about the customers and how they might react to the consequences of employees working remotely. This essentially says, what evidence do we have? Is it a lot or a little? And is that evidence, does it contain information which can tell us with any degree of confidence how likely it is that each one of these assumptions will hold up? The second column isn't about what's in the evidence, it's where the evidence comes from. So if you're Googling the internet and you're just looking at a website and you find some data, then that evidence would have a low score in this column because there isn't any way to be able to validate or to be able to objectively determine what's the reliability of that evidence. But if the evidence comes from your own proprietary data or information about your employees that's been diligently collected by your HR group, if it's about the training programs available and ways to be able to track training and so on, if the source of the evidence in column 1 is reliable, then it deserves to get a high score. So what we are looking for in order to be able to have a high degree of confidence that the decision, the desired outcome of this decision will occur, we want high scores in columns 1 and 2. Conversely, in columns 3 and 4, these are the impact columns, so the lower the impact, the less risk there is that the desired outcome will fail. So therefore, we're looking for lower scores in columns 3 and 4. In the third column, what we're looking for here is essentially the domino effect, that if one particular assumption fails or scores low, well, in this case, scores low in the first two columns in terms of the availability and the credibility of the data, if it has a high score in this third column, it will be that is a very, very material weakness in our expectation that the decision will hold up. But if it scores low or relatively low, then even if it doesn't hold up or not to the extent that we would like, it won't necessarily completely derail the desired outcome. So a low score in column 3 indicates that individually an assumption may not be critical to the holding up of the other key assumptions. In the fourth column, this is the impact of that particular assumption on the overall outcome. So in other words, the higher the score doesn't mean necessarily that there's anything wrong with the assumption. It only means that if that assumption, say the first one, our employees can perform their duties remotely, if that assumption is very high on the rating scale, then there really can be no tolerance for weakness in the data or weakness in the source of the data, because that is one of the assumptions that has the highest impact on the overall outcome. So now that I've explained these 4 columns, it's time now to show you actually how I've populated these columns. And what I've done is I've done 2 versions. So let's look at the first version here. So what I did is that I did 2 versions with the same ratings, only I rated them for a company which scores relatively highly because prior to the crisis, out of good prudence, risk management, disaster preparation, and so on, the company was relatively well prepared for an unexpected crisis like the one that we're currently going through. So what you can see in the first column here is that although the evidence about the employees performing their duties isn't so high, part of that perhaps has to do with the fact that this question hasn't been asked before, but the company has all the information that it needs in column 2 to be able to determine whether or not they can perform their duties. So there's a high degree of credibility, although the evidence hasn't been gathered. So at this point, perhaps the company was caught unprepared and that it actually has to do more research, but it does have the ability to verify whether or not the employees can perform their duties, or at least a reasonable number of them. And the second assumption, so looking from left to right, in this case, this is the evidence seems to be pretty high, that a lot of people amongst the employees are saying that they have the ability, but the company may not be entirely sure that's true. Basically, that's a lot of information being supplied by the employees that probably hasn't been verified. And so therefore, there's a lower score, not the worst of scores, but a lower score assigned to how credible that information is. Training the employees and gets a high score on both counts because the training methods are in place in this hypothetically well-prepared organization, and the information about how good the training is very reliable. The same with the systems. The company has systems with spare capacity and a very solid and capable IT group, so they score highly in both of those. Now, the question as to whether or not the customers will respond positively or at least neutrally to the temporary inconveniences, well, the company doesn't have an absolute certainty on that. Neither they nor their customers have actually confronted this situation before. So what they'll do is they'll give a score which is, you know, above the median, but nonetheless, it's good enough. So overall, in the first two columns, what we're seeing is relatively positive situation for the availability and the credibility of the data. Now, as we look across to column 3, what we can see is which of the assumptions that are absolutely crucial because they will potentially cause the other ones to fail. Well, if the employees can't perform their duties, then it doesn't really matter so much if they log in or not. So it's really critical that they can perform their duties. It's really critical that the systems in the fourth one of the assumptions function, because otherwise the entire premise of remote working can be completely can fail altogether. It's not so critical that the customers do or don't accept the temporary inconveniences. At least we want them to, but it doesn't mean necessarily that the other assumptions won't hold. So if you look at that column 3, you can see that some of the assumptions are more critical to the success of the others, and some of the assumptions are not so important. And then lastly, in the final column, what we see is basically this is where the critical elements of this desired outcome really get validated. So the employees have to be able to perform their duties. If not, we can't possibly serve our customers. The employees have to be trained to access, because otherwise they can't perform their duties. The systems have to hold up, because otherwise none of the remote working is going to work. And truly, the only way that we can achieve our customers' safe and reliable service is, in fact, if they accept some of the temporary inconveniences. Whether or not our employees have the equipment isn't so crucial, because if they don't, I'm sure there's a workaround. The company can ship computer and other equipment to the employees. So very quickly then, I ran through the entire range of the ratings for this company, which passes more or less. Let's then quickly, while we've still got a few minutes, let's then quickly look at the companion company that I did the same analysis for, but where they were much less well prepared. So what I've done here is then I've simply highlighted in red the ratings in the data columns 1 and 2, which are significantly below the ones of the company that was well prepared. So in our poorly prepared company, they're not sure at all if their employees can perform the duties, and they don't really know if the information that they have on that is good. They're also not as good as far as the computer equipment, although we know that that's not as critical because they can still be supplied with the equipment. They're not sure if they can train the employees or not. They're not sure if the systems will support the traffic. They're nowhere near as sure that the customers will be able to accommodate the changes. So we have essentially in the first two columns the data that is supporting the premise that the company can safely transition to remote working is definitely inferior, quite demonstrably inferior to the well-prepared organization. But in the last two columns, so columns 3 and 4, because the assumptions have the same domino effect or overflow effect, one assumption on the other, and because the assumptions have the same impact on the overall outcome as in our first example, what we then get is, if you look across the first key assumption, it's an assumption which is not only a 10 when it comes to its impact on the other assumptions, it's a 10 when it comes to its impact on the overall desired outcome. And yet in columns 1 and 2, the scores are very worryingly low. So essentially what we're seeing here is that the rating of the data for company B and the rating of the data for company A provide the evidence for very, very different inferences and conclusions. And this is the way that exactly the same situation can be profiled and examined and objectively analyzed and then transparently communicated to the stakeholders based on the fact that the same methodical analysis using the same tool that we've just seen a brief example of today, the same tool can make a very, very critical assessment as to whether or not company B is going to succeed if it transitions to remote working in meeting its customers' requirements, and a very material difference and a much better level of confidence for company A because of the data that rates much more highly in columns 1 and 2. So anyway, that was a very brief visit with the key assumptions check. And of course, it's important to remember that the ratings that were done for that key assumptions check were done at a certain point in time. In my case, it was March 13th. For any kind of key assumptions check, it's perfectly reasonable and that the check would be reviewed and updated, not necessarily on a daily, but certainly a weekly basis as new information comes in. New information that can populate those columns, the first two columns of data, that can change the level of confidence in the outcome. So it's a dynamic tool. Once it's populated, once the key assumptions are selected and the first assessment is done, then continuously that can be updated as new data comes in, which is certainly the case for all of us with regard to COVID-19. So briefly then, just to talk about how this key assumptions check that has been performed in a collaborative fashion and documented, how it can be translated into a meaningful contribution to the decision-making process. So the inference from the ratings is that company A is justified in having a high level of confidence that it will be able to meet its customers' needs in a reliable fashion. But the evidence is much less confident for company B because it cannot reliably justify that its employees can perform those 4 important functions that are 4 of the 5 critical key assumptions that underlie the desired outcome. So with those inferences then, how do you communicate those to the stakeholders? Well, there's no magic bullet here. The way that I'm showing here is one which has been field tested, but there's no reason why anyone should follow a particular script. Ideally, there should be a very brief description of what is the recommendation, and then talk about the same recommendations that the inferences that I described in the previous slide. And then, in order to be able to explain to an extremely critical and sophisticated audience exactly how those inferences are based on evidence rather than just a bunch of people getting together and trying to reach a consensus, describe the important 3 steps that went into the preparation of the key assumptions check. First, the very careful selection of the key question. Then the second, the collating of all of the working assumptions then the whittling down of those working assumptions into the five or six key assumptions, and the rigorous key assumptions check. And it won't surprise you to know that in a group of, let's say, 6 or 8 people working on a key assumptions check, even after they've agreed on what are the key assumptions, and they go through the rating process of those 4 columns one by one, each column and each assumption, it can take hours, because the different stakeholders coming from different functions with different levels of experience, views, opinions, their own biases and emotions and so on, the convergence of all of those diverse contributors to the key assumptions check is one of the most valuable and important steps, because it's only when all of the opinions have been essentially melded and a final consensus arrived on those ratings that the key assumptions check becomes essentially bias-free, free from emotions, because all of the emotions of the various contributors will have been filtered out during that discussion, eventually arriving at a consensus for those for the 4 ratings for each assumption across the table. And then finally, after having explained that whole process, because it's very important to demonstrate to the audience that this rigorous process took place, that some of the top employees of different functions got together, spent a couple of hours working on this very important analytical process, and the results can be seen, the evidence is tabulated, the method, all of this is explained, so that the results can stand on their own merits as being justifiably objective, as free from biases and emotions as is possible. And then finally, before just simply delivering the results, the recommendations, the inference to the audience, this is an opportunity for risk managers in particular to be able to contribute some recommendations or suggestions as to how any ratings that are worryingly low in any of the data columns that I mentioned, how they can actually be improved, what kinds of actions the company can take in terms of, let's say, quickly contracting with a third party to provide the training so that the employees can get up to speed rather than trying to muddle their way through internally. Things that they can do to get those ratings higher so that the confidence level in the desired outcome can be improved to the point where the decision seems that the desired outcome is reasonably confident of occurring. So I really raced through everything. That normally takes a couple of days, plenty of practice. So believe me, I'm not expecting any of you to jump on this method and start using it. But I do want to say into conclusion that this method, or any other method that is as rigorous as the one which you've just briefly seen, this is something which is going to be much needed during the coming months. So we looked at a decision which has predominantly been made by major organizations globally, but there are many more decisions which are coming, and I'm just briefly mentioning a few here. The decision to go to remote working was one which has been taken, and we just looked at it, in hindsight with a couple of examples. But there's other decisions such as resuming on-site working. How are companies going to juggle the health issues, the financial consequences, the customer reaction, many other important elements of that decision? They're going to have to make just as meaningful decision about resuming on-site working, about making sure that their customers and that their employees are safe in whatever are the prevailing health conditions when the crisis is over, and whether or not their business model that existed before the crisis is no longer essentially that needs to be seriously reworked because the whole world, the economy, society, and so on has suffered a radical change as a result of the crisis. These kinds of decisions deserve just as much attention and analysis as the key assumptions check that we just briefly visited for the remote working. So what my recommendation to you is, since risk managers haven't necessarily had the most well-established role in crisis decision-making in the past, tools like this, tools like the key assumptions check, these are tools which can be adopted by risk professionals so that as these very important decisions which are coming down the pike need to be made, risk professionals have material, have evidence, have critical thinking and objective analysis to bring to the table that previously was not needed, but now in this crisis situation is needed more than ever. So hopefully those of you that have the opportunity or that feel that this role is yours for the taking, you'll go out there and use this or some other method and play a crucial role in your own organization's high stakes decision making as the COVID-19 crisis rolls forward.